Like Craig said, started a video series called Everything is a Remix a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago. Released it for free on the net. First part was about music, second part was about film, third part was about technology and innovation. That's mostly what I'm going to talk about right now. And the fourth part was about the law. So you can watch those all for free on the net. Rather than explain the premise, I'll just show you the start of part one to kind of set the stage.
Remix, to combine or edit existing materials to produce something new. The term remix originally applied to music. It rose to prominence late last century during the heyday of hip-hop, the first popular music form to incorporate sampling from existing recordings. Early example, the Sugar Hill Gang samples the bass riff from Chic's Good Times in the 1979 hit Rapper's Delight.
Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rapping to the beat. And me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet.
Since then, that same bass line has been sampled dozens of times.
What a scene, pulling up with Jodeci, blasting out my 15. My girl, see my got the good life, no stripe, real nice. And I'm a papa, my son Trey,
Eu sou velho caderninho de telefone, com o nome e o número de monte de mulher. E ele vai ligar.
Skip ahead to the present and anybody can remix anything, music, video, photos, whatever, and distribute it globally pretty much instantly. You don't need expensive tools, you don't need a distributor, you don't even need skills. Remixing is a folk art, anybody can do it. Yet these techniques, collecting material, combining it, transforming it, are the same ones used at any level of creation. You could even say that everything is a remix.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. So remix, what do I mean when I say this? So it started in music. I'm using it in kind of a more broad application. When I say remix, I basically mean you're making new stuff out of old stuff. So pardon the technical jargon. I hope you can keep up with me here. New stuff out of old stuff. So for instance, you take a couple of old songs, you slice them up, put them together, you adjust them to make the thing work, then you've got a new song. But you can still see the chunks of the old song in the new song. And those pieces are referred to as samples. So remix can be thought of as the arrangement and transformation of samples, but I think remix is a good metaphor for any kind of creation. So copying things, transforming them, combining them, those are kind of the basic elements of any kind of creativity. This is in opposition to our myths of creativity. What we don't have realistic ideas about how creativity actually happens. We have myths, we have stories, and they're good stories, but I think they lead us astray in important ways. Am I going to get a laugh here? Sometimes I get a laugh at this. I just want to see what happened. All right. Touched by the hand of God. This is how creativity was conceived of for centuries, for a very long time, up until the last couple hundred years. Artists weren't considered powerful enough to actually originate something. All they could do was sort of channel God, channel the beauty of God. And that's the way things were for most of our history. That's an idea that's kind of stuck with us. We don't think of creativity as being divine necessarily anymore, but it is some sort of elevated, sort of mysterious activity, and we seem to kind of want to keep it there. A couple of years ago, the Romantics came along. Beethoven is an early example. And the Romantics, in a lot of ways, were the reverse reaction to this kind of narrow role that artists had had up until then. So they claimed their creations as their own, as the expression of their own inner selves. So they're creating from within. They're not channeling anything. It's coming from within them. And again, this is sort of an idea that we're stuck with as well. We like the idea of this singular genius who seems to create things without any influence. Whoops. There should be a slide. There it is. Light bulb. Can't talk about creativity in a presentation without showing you a light bulb. So there's the light bulb. Box ticked. This is our most popular visual representation of an idea. So what does this mean? It means ideas happen fast. They happen out of nowhere, like flipping a switch. And they come out of nowhere. You've got darkness and then you've got light. Ideas happen fast and come out of the blue. The reality, of course, is that most ideas, are kind of a sprawling affair. The realization of the idea is kind of a sprawling affair. There's a lot of little epiphanies kind of distributed along the way, but mostly it's just hard work. Lady Mademoiselle d'Avion is a famous painting by Pablo Picasso. This is sort of considered the gold standard for creativity because it was considered unprecedented. Nobody had seen anything like this. But of course, within the context of his time, it was like other things. He was influenced by African art, by classical art, Greek stuff, and by his contemporaries. So Picasso kind of coaxed his creation out of all these other creations that he had available to him at his particular moment in time. So those are some of the myths of creativity. What's the reality? How do we actually create? There are 3 basic elements. So this is a generalization, but I still think it's useful. First thing you need to get is something called domain knowledge. So in order to speak the language of your culture, to communicate with it, it is like a language. You have to learn to speak that language. And you learn to speak a language by talking just like everybody else talks. You don't take the words and start doing your own thing with them, interpreting them. You just talk like everybody else talks. So you get domain knowledge by copying, flat out emulation, just doing your best to sound or look or be like everybody else. You can see this in the career of any artist. So Bob Dylan, for instance, early in his career, he mostly seemed intent on being Woody Guthrie, who was the previous era's folk icon hero. He didn't really seem to want to be the next Woody Guthrie. He just wanted to be as much like Woody Guthrie as he possibly could. And his first album contained 11 cover songs. Almost the entire album was cover songs. And this is kind of the way it was done in the 60s. When an artist was starting out, you didn't release new stuff. Your first album would be mostly cover tunes. Richard Pryor, influential stand-up comic from the 70s. He introduced topics like race, sex, drug abuse, street life into stand-up comedy, which hadn't really been done before. Serious stuff tended to not end up in stand-up comedy. So, he was a massively influential artist. But earlier in his career, he was mostly just kind of doing a bad imitation of Bill Cosby. If you watch his early stuff, Richard Pryor is just kind of a second-rate Bill Cosby. Hunter S. Thompson created something called gonzo journalism. So took journalism, added the novelistic first-person voice to it. And the idea was to acknowledge that journalism is not impartial. There's always some sort of a viewpoint. He just did not pretend to not have a viewpoint. It was completely him. But early in his career, he was just doing straight journalism. And then in his free time, he actually retyped a couple books. He retyped The Great Gatsby and A Farewell to Arms, sat down, retyped them word for word, just to get the feel of writing a great book. So after you've done enough copying to have acquired domain knowledge, the language of your field, it's then possible to create new stuff through transformation. So taking existing ideas and creating variations. So inverting them, streamlining them, expanding them, making them bigger, better, whatever, making mistakes, that's a really valuable thing. These are all the sorts of techniques that you have at your disposal. Steam engine was invented by James Watt, but James Watt didn't just come up with it out of the blue. He wasn't making tea and looked at the steam and thought, hey, it'd be great if you could use that for mining. He wasn't that smart. He was assigned to fix a steam engine that already existed. This fellow named Thomas Newcomen had a steam engine design that would lock up over time. It would run for a while and then it would stop and you have to reset it, and it was super inefficient. So he was assigned to fix that, and 12 years later came up with his own design. So it took a tremendous amount of fiddling to come up with his design, which was one of the a major catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. Typewriter, these were commonly referred to as literary pianos when they first came out, which I think is a lovely phrase. I wish we still used that. But that was kind of the only hook that they had to conceive of this thing. What else do you do this with? It was the only thing it's like a word piano, I guess. That was, that was how they conceived of it. And a lot of the original designs were based on pianos. So Christopher Latham Scholes invented, the modern typewriter layout. He started with a piano layout, 2 rows of keys, one lower, one higher. And he fiddled with that for 5 years and ended up with the QWERTY keyboard layout, which is what we still have on our keyboards now. Thomas Edison, of course, did not invent the light bulb. This isn't controversial. It's pretty well known. There were plenty of light bulbs around before him. He invented the first commercially viable bulb. His first patent application was actually turned down. It was infringing. It was considered infringing. And his second one, the one that is the light bulb, the breakthrough light bulb, was called an improvement in electric lamp. So it wasn't called the electric lamp, it was an improvement to an existing design. And the key to doing it was trying 6,000 different materials for the filament. Again, these are all super time consuming. So these are all incredibly difficult, time consuming things, but they're not new. All these things had already existed before these guys came along. These were the ones that triggered major historical shifts, but none of them were actually new. So to come up with something new, what business people would call a disruptive technology, something that messes around with people's existing business models, you're probably looking at something that involves combinations. So taking things, combining them together, especially when they don't seem to be related, that's a very powerful technique. Albert Einstein, of course, discovered the formula E equals mc squared, but he didn't discover energy and mass or the speed of light. But those weren't all self-evident. They were all major discoveries in their own right. He discovered that they fit together in a surprisingly elegant way. Printing press. This is an interesting one because all this stuff was ancient. So not just decades old, not just even a century, but like centuries. All this stuff was ancient before Gutenberg came along and put them together. So paper, ink, movable type, those are all really old. The key element here was what this fellow's cranking here, the screw press. And this was an inspired choice because it had nothing to do with printing. The screw press was used in food type of production, like you would press olive oil with it, you would press wine with it in China and Rome. So it was that he took something from an unrelated field, integrated into his, that was the key to inventing the printing press. World Wide Web is kind of like the ultimate combination technology. That's Tim Berners-Lee. World Wide Web is basically a hypertext layer above the internet. This hypertext is the text that you click on and travel around with. But then it's kind of a wrapper for the internet, which is another serious combination technology. It's a network of networks. It's a bunch of protocols that manage to speak together because they use open standards and can communicate. So Berners-Lee didn't even have to invent hypertext. Hypertext had been around for, it was popular with nerds. Nerds knew about it. It was kind of like an answer that was looking for a question. It was a technology that didn't have any real application. He added that on top of the net, which was robust and been around for decades, and created the ultimate disruptive technology. So copy, transform, and combine. Those are sort of the basic elements of creativity. You can see these in the arts plenty. In part 2 of the series, I talk about George Lucas, geeked out on Star Wars. Lucas was a huge film nerd, and his influences found their way into the film, sometimes in very recognizable fashion. So here's a clip from part 2.
Even now, Star Wars endures as a work of impressive imagination, but many of its individual components are as recognizable as the samples in a remix. The foundation for Star Wars comes from Joseph Campbell. He popularized the structures of myth in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Star Wars follows the outline of the monomyth, which consists of stages like the Call to Adventure, Supernatural Aid, the Belly of the Whale, the Road of Trials, the Meeting with the Goddess, and a bunch more. Also huge influences were the Flash Gordon serials from the 30s and Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. Star Wars plays much like an updated version of Flash Gordon, right down to the soft wipes and the opening titles design. From Kurosawa, we get masters of spiritual martial arts, a low-ranking bickering duo, more soft wipes, a beneath the floorboards hideaway, and a boastful baddie getting his arm chopped off.
You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
War films and westerns were also huge sources for Star Wars. The scene where Luke discovers his slaughtered family resembles this scene from The Searchers. And the scene where Han Solo shoots Greedo resembles this scene from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The climactic airstrikes in the Dam Busters, 633 Squadron, and the bridges at Toko Ri play very similarly to the run on the Death Star. And in many cases, existing shots were even used as templates for Star Wars special effects. There's also many other elements clearly derived from various films. We have a tin man like the Tin Woman in Metropolis, a couple shots inspired by 2001, a grab the girl and swing scene like this one in The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, a holographic projection kind of like the one in Forbidden Planet, a rally resembling this one in Triumph of the Will, and cute little robots much like those in Silent Running.
So this notion that we are remixing other people's work has some important implications on how we think about originality. Original creations are considered property now, legally and morally. That's the way we think of it. And I get that. I understand it. You know, when you've spent years working on something, you've endured countless failures and setbacks and detours, you know, every inch of it. I understand that, like, in your gut, it feels like it's yours, but it's just not. I mean, not completely anyways. We're very imitative creatures. We do it all the time. We're really good at it. We don't notice it. What we do notice is loss. We notice when people take things from us or when we feel that something's being taken from us. Behavioral economists refer to this as loss aversion. So we're sensitive about losing the stuff that we've got. A couple ideas that are distorting our view here. First one is this notion of the lone creator, this individualistic genius who creates kind of out of the blue from nowhere. I think this is an idea it's in decline. I don't think a lot of people that do creative work tend to think this way anymore. But with the project, I'm trying to hammer another nail in the coffin of that notion. This one's more resilient. I don't think I'll kill it anytime soon. Ideas are property, not going away. Of course, ideas are not property. They're not matter. They're not physical. They're not tangible. You can't actually take somebody's idea. All you can do is copy it. So when I copy your idea, you still have the idea. I also have the idea. But copying is different than stealing. So when we think of ideas as property, I think it indulges, you know, some of these possessive instincts that we have about what we think is ours. Because the tricky thing is that ideas contain ideas. That's how we build them. We build our new ideas out of the old ones. I'm gonna run one more clip. This is from part 3, and it shows how Apple built on the ideas that were kicking around in the 70s, mostly Xerox's ideas, to create the original Mac.
Eventually, Apple got a load of the Alto and later released not one, but 2 computers with graphical interfaces, the Lisa and its more successful follow-up, the Macintosh. The Alto was never a commercial product, but Xerox did release a system based on it in 1981, the Star 8010. 2 years before the Lisa, 3 years before the Mac. It was the Star and the Alto that served as the foundation for the Macintosh. The Xerox Star used a desktop metaphor with icons for documents and folders. It had a pointer, scroll bars, and pop-up menus. These were huge innovations, and the Mac copied every one of them. But it was the first combination it incorporated that set the Mac on a path towards long-term success. Apple aimed to merge the computer with the household appliance. The Mac was to be a simple device, like a TV or a stereo. This was unlike the Star, which was intended for professional use and vastly different from the cumbersome command-based systems that dominated the era. The Mac was for the home, and this produced a cascade of transformations. Firstly, Apple removed one of the buttons on the mouse to make its novel pointing device less confusing. Then they added the double click for opening files. The Star used a separate key to open files. The Mac also let you drag icons around and move and resize windows. The Star didn't have drag and drop. You moved and copied files by selecting an icon, pressing a key, then clicking a location. And you resized windows with a menu. The Star and the Alto both featured pop-up menus, but because the location of these would move around the screen, the user had to continually reorient. The Mac introduced the menu bar, which stayed in the same place no matter what you were doing. And the Mac added the trash can to make deleting files more intuitive and less nerve-wracking. And lastly, through compromise and clever engineering, Apple managed to pare the Mac's price down to $2,500. Still pretty expensive, but much cheaper than the $10,000 Lisa or the $17,000 Star. But what started it all was the graphical interface merged with the idea of the computer as household appliance. The Mac is a demonstration of the explosive potential of combinations. The Star and the Alto, on the other hand, are the products of years of elite research and development. They're a testament to the slow power of transformation. But of course, they too contain the work of others. The alto and the star are evolutionary branches that lead back to the NLS system, which introduced Windows and the mouse, to Sketchpad, the first interactive drawing application, and even back to the Memex, a concept resembling the modern PC decades before it was possible.
All right. I'll close with a quote here that I like. By idolizing those whom we honor, we do a disservice both to them and to ourselves. We fail to recognize that we could go and do likewise. Charles V. Billy is a sociologist at Harvard. This is kind of at the heart of what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to diminish the achievements of any of these people, but I'm trying to show that it's not magic, it's work, and I don't think that they have anything that you don't. So when you make a silly little remix video and you upload it to YouTube, you're dipping a toe in the same pool as all of these people. I mean, it's very primitive what you're doing. It's like the very raw beginning of it. But those techniques, copying, transforming, combining, that's all there is. And if you push those and keep pushing them, who knows how far you can go. Thank you for your time, Fort Wayne. I appreciate it.